November 17, 1938, NBC Radio Studios, New York City. The most prestigious live radio drama program in America was about to broadcast Shakespeare to 8 million listeners. But in Studio 8H, 2 hours before airtime, something was happening that would change how America understood the difference between performing and commanding. John Barrymore stood at the mahogany table that served as the Campbell Playhouse production desk, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had owned Broadway stages for 3 decades. At 56, he remained the undisputed king of American theater, the last of the great classical actors who could fill auditoriums with nothing but the power of spoken word. "Gentlemen," Barrymore addressed the assembled cast and crew, his famous profile catching the harsh studio lights. "Radio drama is the purest form of our craft. No costumes to hide behind. No makeup to mask inadequacy. Only voice, only truth, only the imagination we can ignite in listeners who will never see our faces." The 31-year-old woman, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, did not react. Katharine Hepburn had arrived from Hollywood that morning, her first time performing radio drama, brought in by Orson Welles specifically for tonight's adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew. She wore a simple gray suit, no jewelry, her hands folded as she listened to Barrymore's lecture, with the focused attention of someone accustomed to studying her surroundings before acting. "The problem with Hollywood actors," Barrymore continued, his tone sharpening, "is their dependency on visual artifice. They've learned to rely on cameras to capture their best angles, on lighting to create mood, on editors to hide their mistakes. Strip away those crutches and most of them are exposed as mere faces reading lines." Several cast members glanced toward Katharine. She did not look up from the script in front of her. Her expression remained unchanged, but something in the quality of her stillness shifted, becoming more deliberate, more conscious. "Radio demands what Hollywood cannot teach," Barrymore declared, warming to his theme. "The ability to create entire worlds through vocal truth alone. It requires actors who understand that technique must serve imagination, not replace it." Katharine Hepburn finally looked up. Her gray-green eyes met Barrymore's directly across the table. For 3 seconds, neither spoke. Then she returned her attention to the script without saying a word. Producer Paul Stewart, sensing tension, cleared his throat. "Let's begin our final run-through. We go live at 9 sharp, and Campbell's Soup doesn't tolerate delays." What none of them knew was that Katharine Hepburn had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Born in Hartford, Connecticut, to parents who believed children should think for themselves, Katharine had learned early that the world would try to diminish her simply for being female, for being intelligent, for refusing to apologize for taking up space. Her father, a surgeon, taught her that competence spoke louder than charm. Her mother, a suffragette, showed her that changing minds required not just courage, but unshakable preparation. By 1938, Katharine had already won an Academy Award for Morning Glory and survived the label of box office poison from theater owners who found her too independent, too uncompromising for Depression-era audiences who wanted stars to be grateful and malleable. She had returned to Broadway with The Philadelphia Story, proving her worth by carrying a play written specifically to showcase her particular brand of aristocratic fire. But radio was different. Radio was Barrymore's domain. The rehearsal began with the opening scene. Barrymore's Petruchio filled the studio with commanding presence, his voice shifting effortlessly between rough charm and dangerous authority. When he spoke, experienced radio actors found themselves leaning forward involuntarily, drawn into the performance despite having heard the lines dozens of times. Then came Katharine's first entrance as Katharine the Shrew. Her voice cut through the studio with surgical precision. Not loud, not shrill, but absolutely clear, carrying an intelligence that made every word seem deliberate, considered, chosen for maximum impact. She didn't try to match Barrymore's volume or theatrical flourishes. Instead, she created a counter-melody, equally powerful but completely different in approach. The other actors stopped looking at their scripts. Something electric was happening between the two leads, a tension that made the familiar text suddenly feel dangerous, unpredictable. "Again," said director Paul Stewart after they'd run through the first act. "But this time, remember we're painting pictures for listeners who can only hear us. Every emotion must be vocally clear." Barrymore nodded approvingly. Precisely, radio acting requires transparency. Listeners must hear not just what characters say, but who they are. He looked directly at Katharine. Some actors struggle with this immediacy. They're accustomed to subtle gestures that cameras can capture, but radio demands everything be heard. Katharine's response was almost inaudible. I understand. 2 words, but something in her tone made the entire room pay attention. At 7:30, 30 minutes before broadcast, the final technical checks began. Sound engineer Frank Reddick tested microphone levels while the cast took their positions around the central performance area. The studio audience of 50 selected guests filed into their seats behind the rope barrier. NBC executives settled into the control booth, watching through glass as America's most ambitious radio drama prepared to go live. Katharine stood at her assigned microphone, holding her script but no longer reading from it. She had memorized every line, every pause, every moment where Shakespeare's words would serve her purposes. Barrymore approached her during the commercial break rehearsal. Miss Hepburn, I hope you understand that radio performance is quite different from film work. The intimacy can be overwhelming for actors accustomed to more protected environments. She looked at him with those steady gray-green eyes. Mr. Barrymore, I've been waiting 31 years for an environment this honest. Something in her tone made him pause. But before he could respond, the studio manager was calling for places. At exactly 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, the Campbell Playhouse theme music filled NBC Studio 8H. Orson Welles stepped to the central microphone to deliver the opening introduction, his famous voice reaching millions of American homes from coast to coast. Good evening. This is Orson Welles welcoming you to Campbell Playhouse, bringing you William Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, starring John Barrymore and, making her radio debut, Miss Katharine Hepburn. The red on-air light illuminated. 8 million listeners were now connected to Studio 8H. There was no room for mistakes, no opportunity for retakes, no protection beyond talent and preparation. The play began. Barrymore's Petruchio commanded the airwaves immediately, his voice painting vivid pictures of Elizabethan Italy, his characterization so complete that listeners could visualize his swagger, his arrogance, his dangerous charm. This was why he ruled radio drama. His instrument was perfected through decades of live performance, capable of infinite subtle variations. But when Katharine spoke her first lines as the sharp-tongued Katharine, something unprecedented happened. Her voice didn't compete with Barrymore's theatrical power. Instead, it cut through it with laser-like precision. Every consonant was crystalline. Every vowel carried meaning. She spoke Shakespeare's insults as if she were creating them in the moment, each verbal attack landing with surgical accuracy. The studio audience leaned forward. The NBC executives in the control booth stopped their whispered conversations. Even the sound engineers, accustomed to hearing performances through technical speakers, found themselves drawn into the drama unfolding before them. This wasn't acting. This was combat. As the play progressed toward its central conflict, the battle of wills between Petruchio and Katharine, both actors began pushing beyond their rehearsed performances. Barrymore, sensing he was facing an opponent worthy of his full power, started improvising, adding pauses and emphases that hadn't been in rehearsal. Katharine matched him instantly, her responses demonstrating not just memorized lines but complete understanding of Shakespeare's psychological architecture. When Barrymore's Petruchio became more aggressive, her Katharine became sharper, more dangerous. When he attempted charm, she responded with wit that cut through his facade. The live audience in the studio sat in complete silence, afraid that any sound might break the spell being woven around them. Then came the moment that would enter radio history. In Act 4, during the scene where Petruchio attempts to break Katharine's will through psychological manipulation, Barrymore departed completely from the script. Instead of following Shakespeare's text, he began improvising, challenging Katharine with lines that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than character, from some personal place where John Barrymore the man met his own understanding of power and submission. For a split second, dead air filled the studio. 8 million listeners heard nothing but silence. Then Katharine Hepburn did something that no one had ever done in the history of live radio drama. She improvised back, not just lines but entire speeches, weaving Shakespeare's language with her own intelligence. creating responses that matched Barrymore's psychological intensity while maintaining perfect fidelity to the play's emotional truth. Her voice never wavered, never hesitated, never betrayed any uncertainty about where her improvisation was leading. What followed was 5 minutes of radio performance that transcended entertainment and became art. Two master actors working without a net, creating dialogue that served both Shakespeare's intention and their own artistic necessity. The studio audience forgot they were watching a radio show. The NBC executives forgot they were broadcasting to 8 million people. Even Orson Welles, famous for his own commanding presence, stood transfixed by what he was witnessing. When the improvised sequence finally connected back to Shakespeare's text, both actors were breathing hard, their faces flushed with the intensity of what they had just accomplished. The play continued to its conclusion, but everyone in Studio 8H knew they had witnessed something unrepeatable. As the final commercial break began and the theme music faded, the studio audience erupted in applause. Not the polite appreciation typical of radio broadcasts, but the kind of recognition reserved for witnessing genuine greatness. John Barrymore stood at his microphone for a long moment after the on-air light went dark. Then he walked directly to Katharine Hepburn. "Madam," he said, his famous voice now quiet, intimate, "I owe you an apology. I spoke of Hollywood actors as if I knew what you were. I was wrong. You are not a Hollywood actor at all." Katharine looked at him steadily. "What am I then?" "You are what I am, what I've always been. You are a force of nature who happens to work in entertainment." She smiled then, the first genuine smile anyone in the studio had seen from her all evening. "Thank you, Mr. Barrymore. I learned things tonight I didn't know I needed to learn." Within hours, NBC switchboards were overwhelmed with calls from listeners demanding to know when Katharine Hepburn would return to radio. Theater critics who had heard the broadcast began composing reviews that struggled to find language adequate to what they had experienced. But the most lasting impact was on the two actors themselves. John Barrymore spent the remaining years of his career telling anyone who would listen that Katharine Hepburn possessed the most complete acting instrument he had ever encountered. "She doesn't perform," he would say. "She commands. There is a difference, and it matters." Katharine Hepburn never performed radio drama again. She didn't need to. She had proven what she came to prove, that her instrument was complete, her preparation unshakable, her artistic authority absolute. The Campbell Playhouse broadcast of November 17, 1938, became legendary among actors and directors. Bootleg recordings circulated for decades, studied by performers seeking to understand how two artists could create something greater than the sum of their individual talents. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler. Katharine Hepburn had faced down one of the greatest actors of the American stage on his own terms, in his own medium, before 8 million witnesses. She had neither asked for permission nor apologized for her power. She had simply used it. Years later, when asked about that night, Katharine would say only, "John Barrymore taught me that there is no difference between confidence and preparation. If you have enough of the second, the first becomes irrelevant." The woman who entered NBC Studio 8H that November evening was a successful Hollywood actress seeking to prove her range. The woman who left was something else entirely, an artist who had discovered that her instrument was limitless, her authority unquestionable, her place in American theater history secure. She had spent 31 years preparing for one night of perfect performance. It was enough. Some victories are measured in applause. Others are measured in silence. On November 17, 1938, Katharine Hepburn achieved both, and in doing so, she proved that the greatest performances don't just entertain audiences, they change the performers themselves. That night, NBC Radio became the place where Katharine Hepburn stopped being just an actress and became a legend. The microphone didn't capture her voice, it amplified her soul, and 8 million Americans listened in awed silence as she claimed her place among the immortals. The broadcast ended, but the echo would last forever.